My name is Catherine Semcer, Semcer, Catherine spelled with a C. I'm a research fellow with the Property and Environment Research Center in Bozeman, Montana.
And it goes by the
It goes by the acronym PERC.
PERC, P-E-R.
P-E-R-C.
PRC, that's right. Let's talk about private lands in the United States. We did this mule deer project. We were talking about when we're talking about the land and the stewardship and this public asset, which is the wildlife. How important it is for these private landowners to take care of wildlife, this public resource.
It's absolutely critical. If we look at the latest scientific research, what we're learning is that the future of western big game, species like mule deer, like elk, like pronghorn, depends significantly on the actions of private landowners. Private lands are where we find a lot of the really important winter range for all of these species. And these species can impose a cost on landowners in terms of lost forage, bringing in predators. And it's critical that we make wildlife an asset instead of a liability for landowners, and provide them with economic incentives that enable them to be better stewards of the land.
You probably heard the comment a lot of ranchers will say, "I'm land rich, but I'm cash poor." Mm-hmm. How are some examples that this wildlife can benefit ranchers, the private landowner?
There's a lot of different ways that wildlife can benefit the private landowner. Some states allow for transferable tags, which allow landowners to bring hunters onto their land and to raise a little bit of income by allowing that hunter access. Other ways that landowners can transform wildlife from a liability into an asset is by engaging with NGOs and putting conservation easements on their land, which reduces their tax burden.
That's great. Awesome. Obviously, chronic wasting disease out there, and I know you're not a scientist, but there's some serious threats to kind of this North American model we have that are kind of looming out there. How do you see the future of hunting in the United States with some of these threats? Let's say it's disease, but we also have social media where there's a lot of people out there talking about hunting's not proper, it's not right because of this huge disconnect in our society when it comes to being in nature. How do you see that relationship? What do private landowners, how can they help bridge that gap between the people that live in the cities and where they live out in the country?
Well, when we talk about the anti-hunting movement in North America, I think one thing that's really important for everyone to remember is we're talking about a very vocal minority. The latest polling shows that 70% of the American public supports hunting. People understand that hunting helps put food on the table of families. It helps manage wildlife populations, and it helps keep wildlife populations healthy. One way that private landowners can encourage more support for the conservation of wildlife through hunting is by when they're at farmers markets, making sure that people understand that they're also managing their land for wildlife, and that hunting is critical to providing vegetables. Every vegetable field needs to have its deer managed. Even vegetarians are implicated, if you will, in hunting.
Wow, that's an interesting concept. How are they implicated?
They're implicated because you can't put vegetables on the table without controlling the deer. Not if you're, an agricultural producer. You go to any suburb in America, and people are working to control their deer in their garden plots. Well, imagine that over 50, 100, 150, 200 acres. Farmers use hunting to help control the deer populations so that vegetarians can have carrots and lettuces and kale and other healthy food on their table.
Because the private landowner is responsible for this wildlife, because this public resources lives, the habitat that they own is where the animals live. We have now today issues with chronic wasting disease. We have issues with larger populations of these ungulates where we have car-deer collisions, excessive numbers of car-deer collisions. What are some of the issues that the private landowner needs to, how can they affect the big picture of this thing? I mean, is there, we got some big things that we're threatened with, that could affect our North American conservation model. What can the private landowner do to help solve that problem?
Your guess is as good as mine. Those big issues are not ones that I've really researched very much. So I apologize, I can't answer that question with any real authority.
That's good. I was going to say that. I was like, well, I'm kind of pushing a little bit here. So, all right, we've got this African leopard project. So we're trying to showcase the fact that there's not a lot of information about leopards out there. But leopards live in, for the most part, well, they're like coyotes in North America. They've adapted to live around society where they have, but usually they live in very remote areas. And thus we have and showcase hunting and hunting concessions in Zambia, very remote areas, very underdeveloped, lots of poverty. What can you tell me from your research? How does hunting in these remote locations benefit local indigenous communities? Does it benefit them? If it does, how and why?
It often does benefit these local rural communities in Africa. Every country's different, every country's got a different system, but what they all have in common is that people get a piece of the pie, if you will. The general model that's followed in most African countries is that rural communities are given use rights over wildlife, and then they can either exercise those rights by hunting those animals themselves or leasing the right to hunt those animals out to a hunting outfitter. If they do the latter, they get the meat from the hunt after the outfitter and their client has harvested the animal, and they also get a cash return from the lease fees. That cash is then used to build clinics, fund schools, build infrastructure, provide clean water, all things that people who have until recently lived in desperate poverty need to rise on the economic ladder.
Now, you and I have had a conversation about the relationship between, in these very impoverished areas, it's ripe for the recruitment of radicalization based on religion and other similar type scenarios where people are coming in and trying to control a population. Of course, terrorism is a huge problem throughout the world in these impoverished areas. Can hunting affect terrorism?
Hunting can affect terrorism in a couple different ways. The first is that by increasing the economic mobility of rural people, that is proven to be a key element in decreasing the appeal of radicalization. If people feel that they have an economic future, they're much less likely to pick up a gun and go to war. Hunting can also affect the counter-terrorist need in terms of it provides governance in areas of low governance. Most hunting outfitters are required to have a counter-poaching force as part of their concession, and that counter-poaching force is a force multiplier for local law enforcement and military, and is able to monitor the situation on the ground. Can I re-answer this question?
Sure, yeah.
Hunting is also able to influence, the appeal of radicalization because hunting provides governance in very remote areas, places where central governments typically have very little reach. Most hunting outfitters are required to have a counter-poaching force as part of their concession agreement. That counter-poaching force, in turn, is a force multiplier for law enforcement and national military forces. They're able to monitor situations on the ground and provide a counterbalance to any armed extremist groups that might appear on the landscape, and buy some time until the national authorities can deal with the situation.
We're looking at potentially going to Tajikistan to work with Khalil Karimov. You may have heard of him, but a government minister there that deals with hunting and wildlife, young gentleman, talking about the mid-Asian ibex. And his deal is he's actually helped create these community conservancies. Mm-hmm. In that part of the world, in the Asian countries, how can local communities that create these wildlife conservancies, how does hunting benefit them?
It benefits them much the same way that it does in Africa. People have rights to use the wildlife that they live with, and by leasing those rights out to hunting outfitters, you're bringing cash into regions where a cash economy would not exist otherwise. That cash allows these communities to interact better with the outside world and get the goods and services they need to improve their standard of living.
Awesome. I'm going to go a little bit farther out there. Obviously, a big reason why we're doing this is that we feel we need to educate that 70% that is okay with hunting, as long as they don't see a crazy thing online. Mm-hmm. situations where maybe hunters are being showcased to be disrespectful towards wildlife. We have a huge disconnect in our society with nature, as I said earlier. We've got the anthropomorphism of wildlife because of the Disney and Pixar films. And I ask a lot of people, it's like, well, when's the last time you tried to negotiate the grocery list with your dog? You know, you don't. What do you see as the greatest threat to wildlife and wildlife habitat moving forward in our society?
I think the greatest threat to wildlife and wildlife habitat that we're facing today is the decoupling of conservation from economic growth. Economic growth is happening. It will continue to happen. People have needs. And unless we integrate those needs and the provision of those needs with the conservation of the natural world will suffer.
That's great. Next question. If you were trying to convince a non-hunter, or even maybe an anti-hunter, maybe they just don't understand what's going on, what would you say to them why we should continue to hunt, whether it be North America, Africa, or any other place, before they sign that petition to ban the importation of animal parts on an airline?
I would say to them that conservation is a complex enterprise. Phototourism and hunting are not antagonistic. Rather, they're essential partners in delivering conservation to the people who value the natural world. If we don't have hunting, phototourism is not going to replace it. If we look at the research, only 1/3 of Botswana's wildlife estate is suitable for phototourism. If you removed hunting from the equation in Namibia, better than 60% of the wildlife conservancies would no longer be economically viable. And what's going to happen if these places are no longer economically viable as wildlife conservancies is they're going to be developed. They're going to be turned into mines. They're going to be turned into energy projects. They're going to be turned into unsustainable agriculture. So by taking hunting out of the equation, everyone loses.
So what happens when you take hunting, you no longer have hunting? What actually happens on the ground, whether it be Africa or any other part of the world that's in an undeveloped area?
What we've seen happening in Africa as a result of bans on the importation of hunting trophies is that hunting concessions are being abandoned by the outfitters who manage them. In the wake of that abandonment, those lands are being slowly but steadily converted to agriculture and to pasture land. This means the clearing of forests and the destruction of habitat, which ultimately results in the loss of species.
And it's hunters that are the ones that are protecting those resources.
Hunters are the only ones who are protecting those resources because right now those lands are not suitable for any other use.
It's interesting. In South Africa, we've a lot of people have heard about the, originally those lands in southern Africa were highly intensely farmed and ranched for domestic species, wherever there wasn't a tsetse fly. And then, 20, 30 years ago, they realized, the ranchers, that it was a whole lot easier to run wild game on these animals because of these animals evolving in those habitats, and this is usually fairly semi-arid areas. Can you talk a little bit about the animals that are being, taken care of by hunters are much more the natural animals that should be on there, and whereas the domestic animals aren't, because I'm trying to find a way to tie in. These are landowners, just like we have in Montana, and they're responsible for being good stewards of their land, and that stewardship protects that habitat, and
Right.
the biodiversity that's there is incredible. I was just wondering if you could maybe touch upon that as far as the private landowner, not only in the United States, but in Southern Africa, those models.
South Africa is one of the world's greatest wildlife conservation success stories. If we look at the history of wildlife conservation in South Africa, what we see is that 50 million acres of what were cattle ranches have been converted to wildlife conservancies. Now, what has been the result of that? Well, it's been a stunning rebound of biodiversity in South Africa. The recovery of the Cape Mountain zebra, an endangered species, is directly attributable to the growth of wildlife conservancies in South Africa. But it's not just the game animals who have benefited. And we've also seen the Waterberg mountain butterfly, another endangered species, put on the path to recovery because of the way that private landowners are now managing their land for wildlife instead of cattle.
And they manage it for wildlife because of why?
They manage their land for wildlife because in these very arid environments in southern Africa, wildlife just does better than cattle does. These animals belong on the landscape. They're less susceptible to the perils of drought, and the landowner is able to get a better and more consistent financial return than if they were raising cattle on the same land.
And what does that financial return consist of?
That financial return consists of a number of different revenue streams. There's obviously the trophy hunting trade, which is the dominant revenue stream for these landowners, but also there's also the meat trade, which is directly related to the hunting trade. There's this mythology that hunters just go to South Africa, kill an animal, take its horns, and leave the body there to rot. And that is so far from the truth. What actually happens is those animals are eaten in the commercial market in southern Africa. And that brings in several $1 million each year to landowners who are managing their land for wildlife. Not an insignificant sum of money to someone who was working on very small margins beforehand.
So the benefit in trophy hunting is it's the largest benefit comes from the income from trophy hunting. If trophy hunting were to be eliminated, would these ranchers and farmers have any other recourse, or what would happen to the land and the animals?
I believe that if trophy hunting were eliminated, what we would see happen is that the landowners would reconvert those lands back to cattle ranches. Not because they want to, but because they have to. It's the second best option to the one that they currently employ.
And what happens to the wildlife and the habitat?
And once the land is converted back to cattle, the habitat is destroyed and the wildlife is pushed out.